It is when you're doing it on private property at night with tools in your hand. And don't bother claiming this is part of some observation schedule. You're trespassing and attempting to tamper with my home." She tried to speak, then spun and darted into the woods like a startled squirrel, crashing through brush and muttering threats as she vanished into the dark. The next day, I submitted the footage to the sheriff's office. My son couldn't handle the case due to the conflict of interest, so it was passed to another deputy, who was more than familiar with Karen's antics. He watched the footage twice, then sighed. "You'd be surprised how often we get complaints about her. But this is different. This is criminal." A formal trespass report was filed, and Karen was issued a written warning. For anyone else, that would have been a sobering moment. But not for her. She doubled down again. A week later, I woke up to find that my mailbox had been relocated. Not removed, not damaged, relocated. Someone had unbolted it from the post near my driveway and placed it 50 feet away next to the community walking path. Attached to it was a note in pink marker. "Relocated for easier mail access in accordance with community beautification guidelines." I dragged it back and bolted it into the original post with fresh cement, adding a motion-activated camera for good measure. Then I sent the HOA board a very polite, very detailed letter outlining everything Karen had done over the past month, with video links, legal notes, and timestamp. The response from the board was lukewarm at best. Most of them were scared of Karen. She'd been president for years, not because she was effective, but because no one else wanted the job. She wore them down, shouted them into agreement, or buried them under procedural nonsense until they gave up. But one board member, Jill, reached out privately. "We've had enough," she wrote. "We're calling a vote to remove her next week. But we need evidence that crosses the line. Real, indisputable evidence." I already had it. The footage of her trying to drill open my lock was enough. So was the forged notice, the fake map, and the symbolic plywood gate. I sent Jill everything. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't done. She hosted another HOA rally, this time with a rented speaker system and free cupcake. She titled the event "Save the Bluff, Reclaim Our Peace." Ironically, it was the loudest, most chaotic gathering the neighborhood had seen in years. At one point she pointed toward my cabin and shouted, "That's where the rot begins. A house with no rules is a danger to us all." Some people clapped. Some just stood awkwardly. A few kids took cupcakes and ran off without listening. I watched the whole thing from my porch with a pair of binoculars, sipping lemonade and wondering how she hadn't run out of steam yet. After her speech, she marched up my driveway holding a clipboard again. This time, she said she was issuing a final violation notice. I didn't even read it. I handed her a letter of my own, signed by my lawyer, informing her that she was now under investigation for criminal trespassing, document forgery, and misuse of community resources. She blinked, laughed, and said, "This is retaliation." "I have rights," I replied. "You have fantasies. But the real world has laws." The very next morning, the HOA board held their meeting. Karen tried to prevent it from happening by claiming procedural violations and demanding a full audit of the bylaws. But Jill had already done the homework. The vote moved forward. It wasn't close. Karen was removed as HOA president by a unanimous vote, 10-0. Even her cousin voted against her. She screamed something about legal appeals, then stormed out of the clubhouse with her clipboard raised like a protest sign. My son was the one to deliver the news that her HOA authority was officially revoked. He did it respectfully but firmly. She tried to argue with him again, but this time the crowd didn't rally behind her. They just stood there, watching in silence as her power crumbled. A few people clapped. Someone whispered, "About time." As Karen drove off in her hybrid SUV, a trail of HOA flyers fluttered out of her open window and landed on the grass like surrender flags. It should have been over. But with Karen, you never really knew. She was the kind of person who believed the universe owed her control, and when she couldn't get it legally, she'd find another way. But the difference now was that she no longer had the illusion of power. No title, no influence, no clipboard that mattered. She had become a story. A cautionary tale. And I was still sitting on my porch, sipping tea, surrounded by wildflowers, with my cameras watching and my cabin peacefully mine. The days following Karen's removal as HOA president felt like the quiet after a storm, a deceptive calm that made you wonder what was still brewing behind the clouds. For the first time in weeks, there were no surprise flags staked in my yard, no forged notices taped to my trees, and no mysterious fines slipping under my door like threatening love letters. It was peaceful, almost suspiciously so. But I knew better than to believe Karen had truly accepted defeat. She wasn't the type to bow out gracefully. She was the type to sharpen her claws in silence, waiting for the next opportunity to strike under a new disguise. And sure enough, her next move arrived not in person, but in the mail. The envelope was thicker than usual, and the return address was a P.O. box from a neighboring town. Inside was a printed letter on crisp, linen-textured paper with a letterhead that read Bluff Community Oversight Initiative. Beneath that, in smaller font, it said, a private entity supporting property harmony. The letter claimed that due to numerous complaints regarding my property's impact on visual unity and shared community experience, I was being served with a request to attend a compliance mediation session. It was signed, Acting Coordinator K. Allen. It didn't take a genius to figure out who that was. Karen had simply created a new fake organization and was trying to launder her control through a phony third-party entity. I took the letter straight to my lawyer, who was both amused and irritated. He flipped through the pages, each one filled with fabricated legalese, references to non-existent community laws, and demands for financial contribution toward a new perimeter beautification project. At the end of the letter, there was even a PayPal link printed in bold. My lawyer chuckled and said, "She's not even trying to hide it anymore. This is textbook harassment. Now she's not just operating under a fake HOA. She's inventing one out of thin air and attempting to collect money under false pretenses. This crosses the line into criminal fraud." He advised me to file a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office. Since my son was too closely connected to the case, another deputy named Hernandez took over. Deputy Hernandez took one look at the documents and raised an eyebrow. "She really tried to invoice you for emotional lawn imbalance? That's a new one." I nodded. "That's Karen. Every week it's a new brand of nonsense." He nodded and said he'd look into whether this so-called oversight initiative had registered anywhere. Spoiler alert, it hadn't. By the end of that week, Karen was formally charged with harassment, falsifying documents, and attempting to operate an unlicensed entity for the purpose of collecting funds. It wasn't a major arrest, but it was official. She was served papers at her residence, and the local community group, which had long suffered under her imaginary rule, exploded with gossip. Neighbors shared their own stories. She'd issued fines for unmowed lawns after a rainstorm, demanded keys to people's sheds, 4 fire safety checks, and once even tried to organize an HOA inspection of someone's attic. That Saturday, a hearing was held at the county courthouse. It was supposed to be a simple matter. Karen would receive a court date, the charges would be read, and bail would be set. But in true Karen fashion, she arrived wearing a suit that looked more like a magician's costume and insisted on representing herself. The judge, a stern woman named Evelyn Marks, listened patiently as Karen tried to explain that she was upholding the spirit of community cohesion, and that her fake organization was merely a grassroots initiative with legal aspirations. Judge Marks cut her off mid-sentence and said, "Miss Allen, issuing fake compliance letters and attempting to collect funds through a fabricated organization is not a grassroots initiative. It's attempted fraud." Karen's defense unraveled in spectacular fashion. She brought out a binder labeled Community Emotional Offenses, which included photographs of my cabin taken from across the road, complete with sticky notes pointing out visual clutter, birdhouse irregularity, and inconsistent porch energy. The judge stared at the binder for a full 10 seconds, then set it down with a sigh. "This isn't a neighborhood mediation session, Miss Allen. It's a legal hearing. Do you understand that?" Karen huffed, crossed her arms, and said, "This is an injustice to property harmony." The courtroom, filled with a few neighbors who'd come just to witness the spectacle, erupted in stifled laughter. In the end, the court scheduled a formal hearing for the following month and issued a restraining order preventing Karen from making contact with me or stepping foot on my property under any circumstance. She was warned that any further actions resembling those described in the charges could result in a more serious legal response. As she left the courthouse, reporters from the local newspaper tried to interview her, but she held her binder over her face and muttered something about being persecuted by anarchists. The next morning, I woke to find a familiar shape on my porch, a shoebox wrapped in brown paper with no return address. I opened it carefully, half expecting glitter or bees, but inside was something entirely different. A printed apology letter from Karen. At first, I thought it might be real. But as I read it, I realized it was more of a sarcastic farewell note. She claimed to be moving on to a more receptive community, and wrote that she hoped her replacement understood the responsibilities of regional oversight. At the bottom of the note, she'd scrawled in handwriting that was unmistakably hers, "You may have the law, but I had the vision." That afternoon, my son came by for a visit. We sat on the porch and shared a beer while he laughed at Karen's latest antic. "You know," he said, "there's a chance this is the last we'll hear from her. But if not, at least she's finally facing consequences." I nodded and replied, "I just hope she finds a new hobby that doesn't involve clipboards and trespassing." Things slowly began to return to normal. The community, now free from Karen's reign, actually began to function more peacefully. The new HOA president, a quiet man named Leonard, sent me a handwritten letter of apology along with a gift basket containing homemade jam and a bottle of honey. He wrote, "We never realized how far she was taking things. Thank you for standing your ground." It was the first sincere gesture from the HOA in years, and I appreciated it more than I let on. But just when I thought the final chapter had been written, something unexpected happened. One of my trail cams picked up a figure late one night walking along the edge of the wood. They didn't approach the house or tamper with anything, but they lingered for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the cabin. The image wasn't perfectly clear, but there was something unmistakably familiar about the posture, the height, and the ridiculous reflective vest. I didn't say anything to the sheriff's office. I didn't call anyone. I simply installed a few more cameras, reinforced the locks, and made peace with the fact that some people just can't let go. Karen had been stripped of her title, charged with real crimes, and publicly embarrassed in court. But deep down, she probably still believed she was right. She'd built her entire personality around the illusion of control, and without it, she was a balloon drifting without direction. Whether or not she ever returned didn't matter. What mattered was that she no longer had power here, not over the community, not over my property, and definitely not over me. And yet, as the wind rustled through the trees that night, I couldn't help but think about how someone like her would reframe the entire saga in her own head. Not as a fall from grace, but as a noble mission misunderstood by the unworthy. In her mind, she probably thought she'd lost the battle, but not the war. I smiled, took a sip of tea, and whispered to no one, "Karen, you brought a clipboard to a courtroom fight. And lost. Please don't ever change." But I already knew she wouldn't. The calm that followed Karen's downfall had a peculiar quality to it, like the silence that lingers after a long, loud storm. The community shifted back into something closer to normal. People began to leave their homes without fearing clipboard ambushes or unsolicited lawn inspections. I started seeing neighbors walking their dogs near the lake trail again, some of them even waving when they passed by my cabin, as if now that Karen was out of power, I was no longer radioactive. The HOA board, newly reorganized and freshly humbled, took a quieter,